During the analysis of the Titanic's wreckage, engineers realized the hull wasn't breached by a single impact. It was opened in multiple points along the starboard side. What if the famous maneuver to avoid the iceberg not only failed to save the ship, but actually expanded the damage? Today, we reconstruct, minute by minute, the decisions on the bridge that night of April 14, 1912, cross-referencing official records, survivor testimony, and modern simulations. Before we move into the maneuver that changed the Titanic's destiny, like this video and subscribe to follow every detail of this technical investigation into the impact. That night, the Titanic had already received multiple ice warnings from ships along the same route, pointing to iceberg fields ahead. Some of these messages were held up in the radio room, mixed with passenger telegrams, and not all were used for navigation. Even so, the ship maintained high speed, trusting the hull and the watertight compartments. The lookouts, without binoculars, relied only on direct sight in an unusually calm sea, where the lack of waves made the ice harder to spot in time. Later, investigators would point to this mix of confidence, speed, and deceptive visibility as a decisive factor in the delayed reaction. Just before 11:40 p.m., the lookouts keep sweeping the horizon, letting their eyes adjust to total darkness. Suddenly, a pale shape stands out against the sky, like a motionless wall dead ahead of the bow. Frederick Fleet recognizes the outline and knows it isn't cloud or haze. It's ice on a collision course. He rings the warning bell and phones the bridge, reporting, "Iceberg right ahead." From this instant on, every second matters, for the crew's response and for the maneuver that will be attempted. The moment the iceberg warning reaches the bridge, Murdoch has only seconds to act. He orders hard a port on the helm, then signals the engine telegraph to stop and, moments later, to reverse. But that sequence can't instantly change a ship the size of the Titanic. The order travels down through levels to the engine room, where engineers and stokers adjust valves and steam flow. As the hull begins to swing slowly, speed drops only gradually. The physics of momentum, combined with the short distance to the iceberg, limits how much the maneuver can truly change the outcome. At 11:40 p.m., the gap between hull and iceberg reaches its limit. The Titanic has begun the turn, but the ship's inertia drives the bow forward more than intended. Instead of a head-on collision, the ice catches the starboard side. The contact starts as a long distributed scraping, with pressure concentrated below the waterline. On the surface, many feel only a mild shudder and a muffled sound, no single explosive crash. But on the lower decks, the sound of metal under strain and rivets giving way signals structural damage spreading across multiple compartments. Right after the scraping, water begins entering the forward compartments through small tiers along the hull. At first, narrow jets appear. Within minutes, they become continuous flows. In the mailroom and the holds, crew members and staff watch the level rise quickly across the floor. Engineers go down to inspect and confirm this isn't one isolated leak. It's multiple entry points spread out along the ship. Watertight doors are activated to try to contain the advance, but the affected compartments are filling at an alarming rate, changing buoyancy at the bow. Minutes after the impact, fragmentary reports reach the bridge. Captain Edward Smith is called and told there was contact with ice, but with no clear sign of surface damage. Engineers and crew head down to check the holds, the mailroom, and the forwardmost sections. When they return, they report water entering several areas at the same time. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer on board, is summoned to assess the situation. Cross-checking the damaged locations and water height, he realizes more than 4 compartments are compromised, putting the Titanic's buoyancy at critical risk. With the first compartment data in hand, Thomas Andrews quickly calculates the scope of the damage. Water is flooding not only the extreme bow, but spreading across 5, possibly 6 watertight compartments. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 flooded. Beyond that, the waterline would climb over the tops of bulkheads, allowing the sea to spill backward. Andrews tells Captain Smith the ship isn't about to sink immediately, but the process is irreversible. From this moment on, every decision revolves around remaining time, not avoiding the sinking. With confirmation that more than 4 compartments are compromised, Captain Smith understands the Titanic cannot remain afloat. The priority becomes buying time and organizing evacuation. He orders a definitive reduction in speed and asks the wireless operators to begin distress calls with the ship's approximate position. On deck, some officers receive instructions to ready the lifeboats, still without publicly announcing the risk of sinking. Stewards begin waking passengers discreetly, while the crew tries to project control, even knowing the situation is structurally irreversible. As the minutes pass, the bow's tilt becomes more noticeable on the lower decks. In some compartments, water has already risen past waist height, forcing crew to retreat to higher levels. Pumps are activated to reduce the flooding rate, but they only slow the advance. On the passenger decks, the slight slope becomes visible in glasses, chairs, and in the effort required to walk against the angle. On the boat deck, small groups form, mixing curiosity and uncertainty, while officers try to maintain order around the craft, now being prepared. As the lifeboats begin to be readied, Andrews explains to the captain the specific effect of the maneuver that was executed. Instead of one concentrated head-on impact, the hull scraped along the iceberg, opening a sequence of ruptures across multiple starboard compartments. Later studies and simulations suggest this distribution of damage was decisive in the rapid loss of buoyancy. The attempt to turn spared the bow from immediate destruction, but created a long leak zone that was nearly impossible to control. If you want to follow this technical reconstruction of the impact and the sinking step by step, keep watching and support the work with your subscription and your like.
Quickly now, plenty of room. Women and children first. Step lively, please.
With the first lifeboats in the water, the contrast between the Titanic's still stable appearance and the internal advance of flooding grows sharper. On the lower decks, the bow continues to sink, making stairways and corridors tilt more with each passing minute. The pumps run at their limit, but cannot offset the volume entering through the tiers on the starboard side. On the surface, some passengers believe this is only a precaution. Others notice the mismatch between half-empty boats and a brightly lit ship. The initial maneuver, which spread damage across several compartments, now becomes a progressive loss of stability. As flooding advances, water begins to overtop the upper edges of some forward bulkheads, spilling into compartments that had been intact. In real time, this confirms what Andrews had modeled on paper. Past a certain point, the ship begins to sink in sequence, not just at the bow. The list increases slowly but steadily, affecting stairways, corridors, and the operation of machinery. On the bridge, the captain must divide his attention between launching boats, communicating with other ships, and monitoring internal flooding. The maneuver that avoided a head-on collision now reveals itself as a direct factor in the long, spreading damage. At this point, the ship's behavior confirms the structure has entered a no-return phase. The bow sinks far enough for successive compartments to be invaded above the level the design could withstand, and the list begins to directly affect movement and internal systems. Based on the rate of flooding, Andrews estimates the Titanic has limited time before it loses overall stability. The maneuver that distributed damage along multiple starboard compartments transformed a localized strike into a progressive collapse, now visible in every meter of hull approaching the waterline. With the point of no return reached, the internal dynamics of the sinking accelerate. Water pushes into more central areas, affecting lounges, corridors, and sections near the boiler rooms. The increasing angle turns movement into a constant effort, forcing crew and passengers to use railings, walls, and furniture for support. Lifeboats continue to be launched, but the usable boarding window shrinks as the angle grows. The chain of tears from the starboard scraping continues feeding flooding across multiple compartments at once, making stabilization with pumps and doors impossible. As the bow drops further, the ship's structure begins working at the edge of its limits. Bulkheads face rising pressure, and small deformations accumulate along the starboard side, where the scraping opened multiple entry points. The weight of water concentrated forward shifts the center of gravity and forces the hull into an extreme angle. Pumps no longer influence the outcome. They only delay the inevitable by minutes. On the surface, the sterns rise and the exposure of the propellers make it clear, even to distant observers, that the ship has lost the integrity of its flotation. With the stern rising higher, the hull begins to act like a massive lever. The bow is overwhelmed by water while the midsection endures intense bending between areas still supported by buoyancy and those already submerged. Internal structures groan, and small distortions appear in floors, walls, and metal joints. Andrews and the engineers track the growing angle, aware the stress exceeds what the design ever anticipated. On deck, the list turns the Titanic into a steep plane, naturally pushing passengers and crew toward the stern. while the last boats pull away. When the bow disappears beneath the surface, the Titanic's structural behavior shifts again. The forward section no longer contributes buoyancy. The ship is now supported mainly by the midsection and the stern. Bending concentrates in a relatively narrow zone where compartments still hold air, while the mass of water in the front drags the ship downward. Inside, corridors begin receiving sudden surges of water from lower levels, and the deck angle approaches a critical threshold. The sounds of metal snapping and deformation confirm the structure is nearing the breaking point. With the bow submerged, bending stress concentrates in the central region of the hull. The weight of water forward pulls the ship down, while the still buoyant stern fights to remain afloat. This imbalance drives the structure beyond its design limits. Corridors and compartments in the mid-zone show visible strain, warped floors, shearing noises in walls, and rivets under intense tension. On the surface, distant observers notice not only the extreme angle, but a subtle curvature in the ship's profile, a sign the structure is close to failure. The combination of a submerged bow and a stern still floating pushes the hull to the edge. Maximum bending concentrates across a few frames in the midsection until rivets, plates, and beams can no longer hold. Survivors describe a prolonged roar, as if the ship were breaking in two, followed by sudden drops in lighting in some areas. Technically, the structure behaves like a massive beam overloaded by the weight of water forward. When the hull's continuity finally fails, the sinking of what remains accelerates, completing the chain of failures triggered by the starboard scraping. After successive waves of stress, the hull finally loses structural continuity. The bow section, already fully submerged and loaded with water, separates from the rest of the ship and descends toward the bottom. The stern, relieved of that weight, briefly rebounds, reducing the angle before tipping again. Witnesses report a loud crash, followed by partial blackouts and a sudden rise in the sound of rushing water. Structurally, the break transforms the Titanic into two independent masses. The bow sinks almost continuously, while the stern, still holding pockets of air, remains afloat for a short time before beginning its own collapse. With the bow already lost to the depths, the Titanic's stern remains briefly alone at the surface. Still supported by air-filled compartments, it begins to sink independently. The angle grows again, progressively. The black hull, white superstructure, and four funnels now rise like a tower against the sea. The remaining machinery mass, boilers, and internal structures concentrate in the part still above water, overloading the hull. Water rushes into the open compartments at the break, and the stern prepares to repeat. On a smaller scale, the same loss of buoyancy that began at the bow. With the stern isolated, the final sinking depends on water entering through the shattered compartments and the brake zone. The angle steepens until the hull stands nearly vertical, with the name Titanic on the stern pointing toward the sky before vanishing. The mass of machinery and internal structures pulls the aft section down, while water replaces the last volumes of trapped air. Structurally, the ship no longer acts as a continuous hull. It becomes a remaining block descending under the resistance of the sea. When the stern disappears completely, the surface turns to foam, debris, and sudden silence. Right after the hull vanishes, the North Atlantic surface becomes a field of debris. Planks, pieces of the white superstructure, personal items, and wood fragments drift around the lifeboats. Near-freezing water drastically reduces survival time for anyone in the sea. Within minutes, the roar of tearing structure gives way to silence, replaced by ragged breathing, splashes, and distant cries. For the technical story of the sinking, the debris field and the final positions of bow and stern help confirm the failure sequence. Lateral scraping, multiple starboard tears, progressive loss of buoyancy, then structural break at the center. In the hours that follow, near-freezing water limits the chances of survival for those not in boats. The Carpathia, about 50 miles away, heads toward the distress signals, guided also by rockets seen in the distance. Inside the lifeboats, crew assess the distance to the likely rescue point and try to keep people moving to reduce the effects of the cold. Decades later, the location of the bow and stern sections on the ocean floor would confirm the break and the two-block trajectory, consistent with the pattern of damage distributed along the starboard hull. Through the early morning, lifeboats begin lining up alongside the Carpathia. Crew hoist exhausted survivors by nets and rope ladders, distributing blankets and hot drinks. On interior decks, doctors and stewards record names, trying to organize partial survivor lists. Some Titanic officers and crew describe the impact, the starboard scraping, and the sequence of flooding. These accounts, combined with timing and observations of the ship's changing angle, become the first foundation for understanding why the evasive maneuver reduced a head-on blow, but spread damage so fatally along the ship. In the days and weeks that follow, testimonies from officers, crew, and survivors allow the night's sequence to be rebuilt. Descriptions of the ship's course, the lookout warning, the hard helm order, and the sensation of starboard scraping support the conclusion of a lateral contact, not a frontal strike. Technical reports combine times, flooding rates, and the number of affected compartments, concluding the Titanic could withstand concentrated damage to fewer sections. But not a chain of openings spread along the hull. The maneuver that avoided a direct hit reduced the immediate impact, yet set the stage for flooding too extensive for any compartment system to contain.